Hey there, fellow netizens. This is Kevin in the editor's chair. Just before we start this episode, I just want to make a note that there is a content warning. There is going to be some discussion of mental health, some talk of substance misuse, as well as talks of suicide and suicidal ideation. I will put timestamps in the description if you want to skip past those things, and I'll also include some resources if you or someone you know is struggling with these issues. And with that, let's get to our show.
There's Satan there and that them D&D hills.
Hello, fellow netizens, and welcome to Scandalous Games, the show where we take a closer look at video game-related controversies. I'm Kevin Impellizzeri, and I do the research and share a story of a video game-related controversy to my friends.
Hi, I'm Phil, and you might as well consider me a video game newbie.
Hey, I'm Andy Hunter, a longtime fan of all things Nintendo and a longtime tabletop gamer.
I'm Kate. I have been making software for over a decade, but not the fun kind.
This time around, we're going to do something a little bit different. You know, we always do video game-specific controversies. Instead, today, we're going to go back to a different type of gaming. We're going to talk about tabletop gaming, and you can't talk about tabletop gaming without talking about Dungeons and Dragons. And to talk about Dungeons and Dragons, because it had its own share of very fascinating controversies, I actually did something different than we usually do, and actually brought in a real-world expert onto our show. Very unprecedented territory in here. Matt Shoemaker. Matt Shoemaker is a librarian, archivist, and historian who's the head of the Loretta C. Duckworth Scholars Studio at Temple University Libraries. At Temple, he works in digital scholarship and the digital humanities, where they have areas such as a makerspace and virtual reality lab under his purview. For game history, Matt focuses primarily on analog gaming, and he's been involved in documentaries on the history of Dungeons and Dragons, has assisted D&D historian John Peterson with research on his published works, and more recently published the book Gathering of Gamers, which focuses on the history of modern analog games as they developed through the gaming convention Gen Con. Matt is also a tabletop game designer and publisher, and has released titles such as Be Lives, We Will Only Know Summer, Dirt Dog, and the Charles S. Roberts Award nominated title The Red Burnous, Algeria 1857, through his company Hidden with a Shoe. And in the interest of full disclosure, back when Matt was preparing the Kickstarter campaign for Be Lives, Kate and I were both at Gen Con with him. Really happy to have you on the show. Matt, of course, has his new book coming out called Gathering of Gamers, Dungeons and Dragons and Other Games Through Gen Con, which is a comprehensive history of the convention Gen Con, which is now available through Play Story Press. Matt, how you doing? Thanks for coming on.
Oh, thanks for having me, Kevin. It's great. And thanks for the reminder about you guys helping out at Gen Con back there in 2018 or 2019. I forget which year that was.
It was 2018, yeah.
48. Yeah, it feels like a lifetime ago now. Yeah, but it's great. Thanks for having me on. I'm happy to be on the show. And I know I mostly focus on analog games, but I promise there's video game tie-ins.
Yeah, with D&D, you can't not talk about video games and talk about D&D. Like, D&D is the inspiration for so many different games. Everything from the fact that, like, so many early video games of, like, the 1970s and 1980s were a bunch of D&D nerds inspired to try to recreate it in a digital form. You wouldn't have games like, you know, Adventure and Rogue and Ultima if it weren't for D&D. And, of course, you know, it invented the fantasy role-playing game genre. And like, there's so many games today, even if they're not like, you know, fantasy role-playing inspired games, there's, you know, so many games that borrow some element of mechanics. If you have critical hits, if you have stats, if you have XP, D&D was kind of the progenitor, kind of the OG of all that. So knowing that, it's going to go around there. What are people's experiences with Dungeons and Dragons?
I first was introduced to it in the summer of 1999. It was the second edition days. I never learned how to understand THAC0. I just would roll the die and my DM would tell me if I hit or not. And I've been playing intermittently since. And yeah, it's one of those games that is as fun as the group you're playing with, because it is a social game. But if you're with a fun group who likes to do make believe and have fun with it, it can be a blast.
I was aware of D&D for a long time from when I was a young child, and I think that when I was probably 11 or 12, I got the standard beginner's kit that was available at the time and tried to play it by myself of an evening and got really frustrated and didn't do it again for a long time. And then as a young adult, got into a friend's D&D campaign that, with respect to that friend, it was a really bad campaign. It was one of those things where we all spent like 2 hours creating characters and got thrown into, mind you, most of us were newbies at the time, thrown into like a level 6 battle royale style arena campaign, and it was just really intimidating and not a lot of fun, and I stepped away from it for a number of years. And honestly, Matt, I remember now that was what our conversation was at the first time we met when we were working together, was about, I described that game to you, and I remember you saying something along the lines of like, sounds like you maybe just didn't have a great experience with that DM. The game doesn't have to be that way. And you invited us to play a game with you that wasn't D&D but was similar. And from there, it kind of got me back into playing RPGs. And at this point now, I've been playing RPGs and even GMing RPGs for a while as a result of that.
So I probably have the least amount of experience with D&D of everybody here. It wasn't until the pandemic that I actually started gaming as far as video games and gaming as far as D&D. With everybody in lockdown, I kind of lost access to the other ways that I would socialize with people in person. But being able to do those things virtually, like D&D over Zoom and video games over, the PlayStation Network, that's what got me into these things. And I realized that these games can be like the third place that people hang out. And it's a framework for you to hang out with some of the people that you care about and your close friends. So that's when I got into a D&D game with some people that I didn't know, but I'm close to now. And then that's how I started video gaming with some people I know and now other people I've made friends with.
Yeah, for me, I started when I was 8 years old. So that would have been 1987 or 1988. I lived in Wisconsin at the time, which was very close to where TSR, which is Dungeons and Dragons publisher, was located in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. And I remember going into a bookstore and seeing on the shelf there Frank Menser's famous red box, which if you know anything about D&D, probably recognize it. It's got a big red dragon on the cover fighting kind of an angry blue warrior who's taking a swing at it. And that was my basic introduction to it. I remember buying the game, or convincing my parents to buy the game, I should say. I was 8. Of course, I had no money. And taking it back to my grandparents' house and reading through and running myself through solo and being enamored with it. And then dungeon mastering my first game there with my grandparents and my family that very weekend. And I was pretty much hooked since then. And I very much was a victim of geography, because not only was I near where Dungeons and Dragons was published, but I also lived about 20 minutes away from where Gen Con was held. And we'll talk more about Gen Con a little bit, but all you need to really know is that the convention was run by TSR, and it was like the mecca of Dungeons and Dragons back then. And my parents, I have a lot of thanks to my parents for getting me into the hobby to begin with, because they took me to Gen Con my first time when I was 12 years old, and I've basically been going ever since. So I have most of my gaming roots, at least for analog games, to thank back to that.
The first time I ever encountered Dungeons and Dragons was when I was in high school. I remember I was in stage crew, and in between shows, one of the guys there was into, I think it was third edition then, and tried to do like a one-shot campaign. And I remember anything of the specific campaign except for the fact that I was a wizard who went to a treasure chest and just found a thing of boots, and I threw the boots away. I was like discarding these things, and the DM rolled to get damage on the boots that I had hit somebody else with them. And I remember being really enamored by that idea and like getting the core rule books, the Dungeon Master's Guide, the Player's Handbook, and the Monster Manual out of the library. And it was a little bit like with UK, where I tried to kind of parse it out myself and really couldn't understand that. And for a long time, didn't have anybody to play with. And to be honest, a lot of it was you, Matt, like you DMing Lamentations of the Flame Princess campaigns with Kate and I, that really got me more back into tabletop role playing. And like we've been fortunate enough that we've been able to find people. I was a little bit like you and Phil, and I found a 3.5 edition group that we played a little bit before the pandemic, then played a little bit during the pandemic. And since the end of lockdown, Kate and I have managed to set up regular campaigns at a brewery not too far from us where we both have the opportunity to DM, and it's both fun to be a player and a DM. So it's just a great little game. But I assume at this point, like people listening to a gaming podcast, they probably know most about Dungeons and Dragons. I'll give the very, very basic introduction. But Dungeons and Dragons, the original tabletop role-playing game, originally released by TSR. The idea is that you assume the role of a single character of a fantasy race. You pick a class, you pick an alignment, and you, with a party of other adventurers, do adventures that are determined by dice roll, weighed by different types of skills. I like to think of Dungeons and Dragons as 90% dice rolling and 10% improv. But what's really cool about D&D and other tabletop games that were inspired by is kind of the idea of like you can run the same campaign a dozen times and it will play differently every single time depending on the people you're playing with, depending on your DM, depending on the rolls of the dice, depending on the priorities of the players and the DM. Like there are combat heavy campaigns, there are role playing heavy campaigns, there are dungeoneering heavy campaigns. Like it offers kind of something for everybody, and I think that's one of the things that's really cool about D&D. And I know when Kate and I do intro, we specifically focus on beginners of like just the idea of like ultimately when it comes down to it is say things you're going to do and we'll roll dice to decide what happens. So we wouldn't really have a Dungeons and Dragons the way we think of it without Gen Con, the main subject of your book, Matt. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about, maybe introduce us to Gen Con and then talk about like what was the role of Gen Con in shaping Dungeons and Dragons and by extension tabletop role-playing gaming.
Yeah, sure. So Gen Con is the oldest and longest running game convention, at least in the United States, and I suspect the world, but I will state right now I am not an expert on game conventions in most of the rest of the world. But from what I know about them, I suspect Gen Con, which started its first instance in 1968, has been running for a very long time, continuously. It ran every year, including during the pandemic. Although the pandemic year, it was a virtual experience. It was not an in-person thing. So if you don't want to count that, don't count it, but I do. So the convention actually started as a wargaming convention. So people playing hex and counter games by places like Avalon Hill, as well as miniature-based games, a lot of Napoleonics, a lot of like naval battles, things like that. And one of the things Gen Con really did was provided a place for people to come together and game. Because this is before people really had ways to connect with each other. The wargaming community was very small. We're talking maybe 20,000 people in the entire United States were playing. And a lot of the games people were either playing just with themselves or they were playing through the mail. So you can just imagine being a gamer in 1968 who loves war games, and suddenly you find out that there's going to be about 100 of you getting together to just play war games for a weekend. And these people got together. It was only supposed to be a 2-day event, but they showed up at Gary Gygax's, one of the creators of Dungeons and Dragons. Special shout out also to Dave Arneson. They came to his house early. They gamed into the night. They gamed, through the whole weekend, even though the show wasn't supposed to happen on Sunday, but they kept playing through. And this was just a great experience for them because before then, I mean, this is really it was all through the mail and magazines is how they all corresponded and got together and such. And through Gen Con, for Dungeons and Dragons specifically, is where Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson met. And that's kind of in person, I should say. They did meet through mail correspondence and telephone before then, corresponding on through Napoleonics campaigns and things. And Dave Arneson was running kind of a dungeon crawl thing up in Minneapolis called Blackmore. And so this is really kind of the prototype for Dungeons and Dragons. Dungeons and Dragons also pulled a lot. I mean, Dungeons and Dragons is a war game. It's a lot of why it's so combat heavy, even to this day, even though you see a lot of people trying to make it more role-playing focused in many ways. And it pulled from a set of rules that Gary Gygax and Jeff Perrin wrote called Chainmail that kind of reimagined wargaming a little bit by adding things like superheroes to the game, which was basically one unit on the field that rather than being, a formation of maybe 20 soldiers, was just one guy who was just kind of like super powered and like a whole unit of forces on his own. So Dungeons and Dragons was a collaboration between Gygax and Arneson. Arneson had a lot of great ideas, but he was really bad at organizing them. And Gygax was good at publishing and organizing and getting the word out. He was a very prolific writer and got things out all the time. So they put together Dungeons and Dragons, and it was a mess, kind of. I mean, it's amazing anybody knew how to play it, and they kind of didn't. It also required other games, like you needed a copy of Outdoor Survival from Avalon Hill. You needed a copy of the Chainmail rules. You also needed the Dungeons and Dragons box set, which was $10 at the time, which was a princely sum for any game back in 1974. And then you had to learn how to play it. And if you've ever read those rules, they are a hot mess. They are hard to understand, even for someone who's a wargamer at the time. And so Gen Con then in 74 and 75 was really responsible for spreading Dungeons and Dragons and making it popular. Without Gen Con, it's very likely Dungeons and Dragons would have stayed something that lived in the southern Wisconsin, Minneapolis area of the country and never gone anywhere else. But what happened is people came to Gen Con, they heard about this new wargaming craze, and they'd try it out. They'd learn how to play it, and then they would go back home and introduce it to their groups. And it really just allowed the spread of the game. And this is something Gen Con has done throughout the years. Gen Con was in Wisconsin from 1968 until 2002. After that, it moved to Indianapolis. I mean, Dungeons and Dragons, I know, is our main topic tonight, but Gen Con is also where Magic the Gathering, the collectible card game, made its big splash back in 1993. And Magic was allowed to spread largely because of Gen Con. Gen Con also was a place where a lot of the gaming social dynamics between gamers was developed. Some of the things I talk about in the book is, how gamers relate to each other, and how also Gen Con and media and other things allowed gaming and gamer life and everything to kind of become more mainstream like it is now, that it wasn't for many years. So yeah, Gen Con is today, I will make the claim, that is the largest specifically tabletop game focused convention in the world. There's of course bigger conventions of gaming like Lucca Games in Italy, and of course Comic Con's bigger, but those don't focus on tabletop gaming, even though they have tabletop gaming elements. Gen Con had 72,000 people attend this year, which is very large. The next biggest show is most likely Essen's Spiel, which is a board game market, essentially, that takes place in Germany every fall. But yeah, Gen Con has been very important for shaping tabletop history. It was also very important for video games in the late 80s and early 90s, largely because there were no other consumer level shows that reached out to gamers besides Gen Con and other shows like Origins, which were smaller at the time. So you had companies come there. I still remember going to Gen Con and playing like Red Alert 2. And I remember when I was like 16 years old, spending hours at Gen Con playing on a LAN of Warcraft 2, which just like blew my mind at the time, because that was not something, I was 16 years old. This is like 1997 or whatever year that game came out. And it was just great being able to play with somebody else. And that's something Gen Con has always been good at, is bringing people together to game. Whether it's video games or tabletop, it's about bringing people together and having that experience in a shared environment.
Yeah, it's really cool to see how it's. I was thinking about video gaming conventions in particular, like E3 launched in. I should know this date. E3 launched in like 1995, 96, but that was a trade convention. That was an industry convention, and I know that like a lot of influential folks in video gaming were coming up through the tabletop gaming community, and I imagine we're connected with Gen Con. I think in particular of like the guys that did software, people like John Carmack and John Romero were like huge D&D fans in the 1980s, and like D&D played such a huge role in the influence of a lot of the games. Like the story goes that Doom came out of a campaign that John Carmack developed in the 80s where John Romero tried to get a legendary sword, and in doing so unleashed demons that destroyed the world, and that became the inspiration for Doom. It's definitely a game where like you see the overlap with other games both in the tabletop scene and in the video gaming scene, and also just like the place where, like, to borrow from the title of your book, it's like it became a gathering of gamers in a time when you didn't see things like that.
Yeah, no, that was a big part of Gen Con for sure. And it definitely had video game roots. I mean, in the 80s, just for instance, like Richard Garriott himself, Lord British, celebrated Ultima's 10th anniversary at Gen Con and threw a party at the convention for the Ultima series, and he appeared for many years as a guest. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of overlap between tabletop, D&D specifically, and most importantly, and video games for sure.
So all those people going to D&D, by your estimation as an expert in Gen Con, how many of them you think were Satanists?
Oh, I don't know. Not many, I would say, but I'm sure there were a few. I mean, I'm sure they existed, but as I'm sure we're about to get into, not the numbers that some of these groups were, reporting. That would be shocking.
How much have you been exposed to, Matt, of this?
How many sigils of Baphomet do you own?
Like, how much of this like relationship of D&D and the occult? I don't know how much you've come across that.
I've come across it a lot, actually.
I wanted to try to have like a controversy related thing to talk about because D&D was the subject of a really fascinating moral panic in the late 70s into the 1980s. And so I thought this was a good excuse having you on, Matt, to talk a bit about this. So all this is going to lead into talking about a figure named Patricia Pulling and an organization called Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons, which was a thorn in the side of TSR during the 1980s and became, I'm not going to say influential, but they were definitely very loud about their concerns about what Dungeons and Dragons was doing. And so I thought for these episodes that we would talk a bit about that and weave more of the history of Gen Con, of the history of D&D into it. Because I know, reading your book, I know that a bunch of it does weave pretty carefully into some of the influence of Dungeons and Dragons and how we think about D&D as these panics over it. So today we're going to talk about the panic over D&D. And so I guess segueing from what you talked about, Matt, in the developing popularity of D&D and Gen Con in the late 1970s, and, you know, D&D slowly into the 1980s starts to enter a cultural mainstream. You see it appear in places like kids playing Dungeons and Dragons at the beginning of E.T. the Extraterrestrial, which was, you know, the biggest movie of 1982, and stuff like the animated series of Dungeons and Dragons. And with this growing mainstream exposure to the game came an unsurprising wave of anxiety as moral crusaders of various stripes begin to worry about all the horrible things, you know, young Billy and Susie might be doing with unchecked imaginations and access to just too many kinds of weird looking dice. And the earliest high-profile panic over the alleged effects of Dungeons & Dragons involved the 1979 disappearance of a 16-year-old Ohio kid named James Dallas Egbert III. I don't know if anyone's familiar with this.
No.
Wasn't Tom Hanks in a movie called, was it Mazes and Monsters or something? Does this serve as the loose basis for that?
This is how Mazes and Monsters gets to say it was huge air quotes based on a true story. All right, let's talk about this. So brief content warning. For a brief talk about mental health issues and particularly suicide and suicidal ideation. So James Dallas Egbert III, he disappears. At the time he goes missing in 1979, he's a freshman at Michigan State University with a lot going on. At the time, he was grappling with stress and mental health issues, including coming to terms with his sexuality. As a result, he ended up self-medicating, even allegedly making PCP in his dorm room, and he battled suicidal ideation. And on August the 15th, 1979, Dallas left a suicide note in his dorm and entered the steam tunnels that crisscross Michigan State's campus with the intention of taking his own life by overdosing on Quaaludes. After his unsuccessful attempt, he ran away from school. And a week later, on August the 22nd, Dallas's uncle Melvin Gross hired an ex-Florida highway patrolman turned private investigator named William Deere to track him down. Have you come across anything about William Deere, Matt?
Oh yes, I think we've seen many of the same things about William Deere. He is quite the I will generously call him showman, I guess.
We have a way of collecting characters. I think, Andy, you described it in a commentary as these freaks that I collect. And Deere is definitely one of those kinds of people. So William Deere, let's talk about this guy. I read his book, by the way. Entertaining read, if any of it were true, and I'm pretty sure none of it is. But anyway, Deere was, to put it mildly, a colorful figure who viewed himself as basically a real-life James Bond. He loved telling people that people thought he was the real-world James Bond. There's an interview he did in the Washington Post in 1984 where he made a point to say to the author that he had replicated his bedroom like Sean Connery's from the 1971 Bond film Diamonds Are Forever. So this guy really, really wants you to know that he is like a real-world James Bond. He also claimed in his 1984 book on the Egbert case that he at one point fought armed cultists to rescue a kidnapped young girl in Erie, Pennsylvania, although citations kind of needed on that one.
What were they armed with? Dice?
Roll for initiative, ladies.
They were armed with pitchforks. That wasn't a mob. That was just the Amish. They live in Lancaster County.
What do you do in English? So yeah, William Deere. And so yeah, with that kind of personality on this case, Deere certainly knew how to make a scene. And he quickly crafted Dallas's disappearance into a media circus with himself as the ringmaster, asserting to anyone that would listen that he was convinced that Dallas was obsessed with Dungeons and Dragons and had either A, completely lost touch with reality and was playing out his character in real life, or B, was acting as a DM in an elaborate real-world campaign in which Deere was the main character. So I ask you, Matt, now, I know that the 1979 iteration of Gen Con was around this time when Dallas disappears. Like, what was the vibe about Egbert's disappearance? Was there any at Gen Con?
There was, well, not at Gen Con, because this all happened shortly after. But when it was announced and they thought he was playing D&D, there were several people who had attended that 1979 Gen Con who had swore they saw Egbert at the convention. TSR checked, and as far as I could tell from the rosters, he was not actually there, so it's not like he was there. But this was a major thing. I mean, the police contacted TSR, and TSR members like Tim Kask were asked to like look at an arrangement of push pins and a cork board in Egbert's room to see if it like made up a dungeon map so they could maybe find him in the steam tunnels underneath the university and all kinds of things like that. And this massively influenced the rise of Dungeons and Dragons, as well as a lot of what happened at Gen Con for the next several years. Like honestly, Dungeons and Dragons probably would not have entered cultural mainstream if Egbert and Deer did not happen, because it kind of blew up the game in the media. And then that got everyone's like, oh, this game makes you suicidal and makes you crazy and wants to do stuff. I want to try that. So you had tons and tons of like tweens and teenagers that picked up Dungeons and Dragons. And then they started doing things like going to Gen Con. And so Gen Con was suddenly, I mean, Gen Con was always a young crowd, like late teens, early 20s, college age kids, largely. I mean, there were some older people, but that was like its main makeup. But then in the early 80s and things like that, you started having lots of families and, older kids coming. And TSR tried to do everything they could to capitalize on that. Like there was one Gen Con where they had a band called Duke and the Dragons that sat there the whole day and made up songs about Dungeons and Dragons and other TSR products that they just kind of sang to these families that they thought would be family friendly. And that same year, they also had like a rude talking robot going around talking to these kids and things like that, trying to interest them in TSR products and stuff like that. So it influenced that. It also severely influenced D&D's product and its image, because they were obsessed with like curtailing this and proving the game had no, ties to Satan or was not dangerous and things like that. So they did stuff like they adopted a version of the comic code for their products so that it wouldn't harbor things like, drug use or portraying law enforcement in a negative light or demons and devils and things like that, trying to get those out of the game. It also influenced what would show up at Gen Con, because they started vetting products, and they were very haphazard about this. I mean, at Gen Con, you have games like Call of Cthulhu, which, if you're not aware, is, you can probably guess by the title, is a game based on the Cthulhu mythos by Lovecraft, which has all sorts of horror and horrific things and stuff like that. And that game was fine. But then somebody else might bring a game based on like a slasher movie or something like that, and they would find Ernie Gygax, Gary Gygax's eldest son, coming up to them at Gen Con, lecturing them about how they couldn't sell their product and they had to take it out of the Gen Con floor, and they couldn't do it all because, it was giving role-playing games and gaming a bad image and showing this. This happened for years. Gen Con also banned all live action games because of this incident that happened with Egbert. So there was no way that you could play like a LARP or anything LARP-like at Gen Con until the 1990s. That didn't get lifted. That lasted for more than a decade. And this was a rule that many people, even at TSR, thought was silly. The staff, even under threat of being fired by TSR staff, held a game of Assassin at Gen Con, which counted as a live action game. If you're not familiar with Assassin, it's basically a game where you're given someone's picture and you're told to find them and kind of go like, bang, you're dead or whatever. And whoever's the last one standing wins. So the TSR staff got a bunch of ping pong ball guns and gave them to their staff. And they were told they couldn't play in front of executives because they would literally get fired if they did that. But they would hunt each other down at Gen Con, despite the fact that these games were, banned at the game because of this whole situation with Egbert and the whole satanic panic that revolved around Dungeons and Dragons and how TSR was trying to protect role-playing games and tabletop games in general.
That's really interesting of how that affected the way Gen Con was shaped. But yeah, let's talk about Deer a little bit more. Going back to what you mentioned, Matt, he became fixated on hidden messages, that he was sure that Egbert was leaving for him. And the most notable one was the one you mentioned. He saw in Dallas's dorm room, there was a set of push pins that were arranged on a corkboard that was roughly in the shape of a gun. And in his book, The Dungeon Master, he obsesses over this. He is convinced that Dallas left him a secret message that he needed to track down, which led to him then convinced that he was somewhere in the East Lansing steam tunnels. And the steam tunnels were basically, again, they were these kind of underground tunnels that went around Michigan State University's campus, which students would go through, especially in the cold winter months, because it was a little warmer down there. You go down there and you explore, and some people would just do random stuff in there, like college students are going to do. And Deer became convinced that, of course, he was down there somewhere. He was dungeoneering somewhere. He was obsessed with his his D&D campaign or whatever, he did not know the difference between LARPing and D&D and kind of saw them as one and the same. And eventually arranged for police to basically scour the tunnels. He thought at one point the gun pushpin thing was a arrangement of buildings. Like he was obsessed over this whole thing. In the end, Deere found Dallas the old-fashioned way. When Dallas called him on the phone and told him where he was. Crack police work.
It's always the last place you look.
Here's a little bit of the story about Egbert and why it was interesting hearing from you, Matt, hearing about like checking to see if he was at Gen Con. I'm not an expert in this. I'm convinced he was never at Gen Con. He never went to Gen Con. Because following his suicide attempt, Dallas couch surfed at homes of a few friends in the East Lansing gay community, one of whom paid his way to New Orleans, where he unfortunately made another unsuccessful attempt, after which he resolved to come home. Deere ended up meeting Dallas in nearby Morgan City, Louisiana, and returned him to the custody of his uncle on September the 13th, 1979. However, Egbert continued to grapple with mental health and substance issues, and he died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound on August the 16th, 1980. And 4 years later, Deere put out a book on his hunt for Dallas, where he portrayed himself as a virile, hard-nosed detective, playing out Dallas's elaborate campaign wherever it led, before heroically rescuing him from the clutches of Louisiana gang members in a book he provocatively titled The Dungeon Master. Deere, I've read this book cover to cover. I think Deere missed his calling as like a mystery novelist. It's actually a fairly compelling read. However, in light of all the stuff we know about Deere now, it won't come as a shock to you that Deere's recollection of Dallas's case is highly contested by the people closest to James Dallas Egbert III, with several of them telling Carla Hall of the Washington Post in 1984 that, to pardon my French, they thought William Deere was full of shit. For example, Dallas's mother, Anna Egbert, told Hall, quote, "Most of the things in the book are inaccurate," end quote. And Dallas's aunt, Betty Gross, added of Deere, quote, "Really nothing he did brought the boy back," end quote. Saying of the Dungeon Master, quote, "I think it's a big bluff to make Deere look good," end quote. "It's all a publicity stunt to make him a star and get him public attention," end quote. Any thoughts on that?
Right up there with the Dave Grossmans of the world, it sounds like.
Andy, can you mention a little more about that, like what the specific ties you saw there were?
Oh, I mean, just Dave Grossman purported to be more involved with many high-profile instances than he actually was. You know, all the way from, if I'm not misremembering, like falsely claiming that his children were in a school that had a school shooting, as opposed to simply lived in the same town, I think. And so just everything Dave Grossman did, he wrote a bunch of books making himself look really great, despite, not actually having much to back that up.
I mean, Andy, I don't want to go too hard at Dave Grossman. I mean, haven't we all nominated ourselves for a Pulitzer every now and then?
William Deere never nominated himself for no Pulitzer, as far as I know. I'll tell you something fun about William Deere, though. Deere, he clearly exploited the Egbert case for years, up until he died. And he died only last year. He passed away in 2024. He used to brag the fact that he was actively involved in this case. He also had other cases like this. I'm only going to briefly mention one, just because I think it's very funny. Years after the James Dallas Egbert case, another big one that he kind of inserted himself into was that he became convinced he knew who really killed Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman. He was convinced it wasn't OJ Simpson. William Deere's wild. He became convinced that OJ Simpson did not kill his ex-wife and her partner. Instead, his son Jason did. And what OJ was doing is he was covering up for his son. And Deere was so convinced of this, he stalked Jason Simpson for years. He would stake out outside of his house. He would go through his mail. He would go through his garbage. He would arrange sting operations. He one time tried to rent the house next door to him so he could wiretap him. Like, this is the kind of guy who did this.
Yeah, and Kevin, I mean, I know we're talking about Deere right now, but when we talk about other people who were prominent figures in the Satanic Panic, I feel like a lot of them had a similar personality. Maybe they weren't quite as bold as Deere, but I think a lot of them were about self-promotion and just proving that they were right without a doubt and anybody else was wrong. And yep, there's Satan there and them D&D hills. Like, no matter what you look, they were the ones that had to be right, and you better listen to them because they're the most important person on earth. I feel like that's a common thread we find with a lot of people, at least with the Satanic Panic as it relates to Dungeons and Dragons. I can't speak to as much because I know video games have had their own share, for sure. But I think it's all cut from the same cloth.
So, Matt, a common theme we talk about on the podcast is about how video games are this persistent whipping child, boy or girl, for whatever violence happens in the nation, like 80s, 90s, like every decade goes by, whenever there's some sort of mass shooting or whatever, video games are blamed. But it seems like D&D was blamed for this person's suicide, but D&D seems to have subsided from becoming like a cultural whipping boy. What do you attribute that to? Do you think that says something about the popularity of D&D? Do you think it says more about society? Do you have any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think that's more about the evolution from D&D into video games. One thing I talk about in the book a little bit that Kevin actually helped me with was about how during the Columbine shooting, all the focus was on games like Doom. But as Kevin already mentioned, if you look at Doom or Quake or any of those games, a lot of their roots, I mean, it is even inspired by like a Dungeons and Dragons campaign. I think reporters just kind of looked at the surface and they saw what's more popular here, more kids playing Dungeons and Dragons, or are they playing video games? And I think video games, I mean, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but you guys might know the market for tabletop games is big. It's something like $22 billion, I want to say. I mean, that's for all tabletop games, not just D&D. That's like board games and stuff too. But video games is much larger. It's just a bigger share of the pie, so it gets more attention. Although one thing I do want to point out is that there was a lot to do with the satanic panic for Dungeons and Dragons all the way up through at least the early 2000s, and it still comes up today. If you go to Gen Con, even this year, I heard about people outside being approached by Christian conservatives, handing out cards saying they should give up playing games like Dungeons and Dragons to save their soul to people attending Gen Con. So that still happens. And also, I have a whole shelf full of made for TV documentaries, TV shows, whatever, about people either committing suicide or murdering their parents or whatever. And those shows behind them is blaming Dungeons and Dragons, saying these murders, these suicides, these things all happen because of tabletop role-playing games, D&D in particular. It's also bled over into other games as well. I mean, D&D was kind of, the first to get it. D&D has a lot of firsts under its name. But even if you look at games like Magic the Gathering, it isn't immune either. I mean, one of the earliest things there was if there was a card in the game called Unholy Strength that had a pentagram in the art. And that was attacked by some of these, people calling tabletop games like part of a Satanist cult. And so Wizards of the Coast fixed that by just removing the pentagram. But that's not the only thing in Magic the Gathering that's been criticized for that either. The game also has demons and things like that. So this is not unique to D&D. It has not gone away completely, but I definitely agree that video games get way more heat for this stuff than tabletop games do right now.
Yeah, and if I were to jump off that, these things happen in waves where there's always like a couple of people who are always like raising the alarms about this, and it's kind of the question if the larger culture latches onto that. So I know that video games got age ratings in 1994 with the creation of the Entertainment Software Ratings Board in the US, largely on the backs of panics over depictions of video game violence, games like Mortal Kombat, games like Night Trap. But I know that there were people who were making the same argument as far back as 1989, 1990, and it becomes a question of how much the larger culture wants to give a voice to these people. And I know with Columbine in particular was they latched on the fact that we'll do an episode on this eventually. They latched on to the fact that the two perpetrators were avid Doom players, and the one was a Doom 2 modder, and that they found his AOL homepage and he talked about being a Doom modder, and it became a very easy, very convenient thing to latch on to. So I think it's a little bit of it's capitalizing on anxieties, but it's also capitalizing on a moment too. And I think the Egbert case is a good example of that because, again, Deere wasn't the only person who did this because, of course, a couple of years after this whole situation, you get Rona Jaffe in 1981, who is a pop novelist, who put out a novel that was basically, all that stuff about D&D allegedly being the cause of Egbert, even though we know it's not true. What if it was? And she crafted a book that came out in 1981 called Mazes and Monsters. And Mazes and Monsters is an extremely loose adaptation of the Egbert case. This is the loosest stretch of based on actual events. Because basically the story of Mazes and Monsters is it follows 4 students of a fictional Northeastern college who gravitated toward the eponymous tabletop RPG that is, legally distinct from Dungeons and Dragons as a coping mechanism for grappling with various personal traumas. And eventually one of them, named Robbie, experiences a complete psychotic break. assuming the role of his character, a cleric. No, not a cleric, a holy man. So you can call off your lawyers, TSR. A holy man named Pardue, eventually wandering down to New York City, and he wanders the streets of New York, believing he's actually in a fantasy world. He dodges sex workers he thinks are sprites. He eludes a subway train he thinks is a dragon, and he inadvertently stabs down an unhoused person he thinks is a succubus. His friends band together to track him down. They eventually find him and bring him home, and in the process, they come to terms with their issues and they kind of grow up. They move on from the game. They no longer need mazes and monsters. However, they find that Robbie has completely lost touch with reality. He is Pardue, and he, as Pardue, ends the story in the care of his parents, who he thinks are kindly innkeepers. He's completely lost touch with reality. The book was popular enough to inspire a made-for-TV movie of the same name, starring a young Tom Hanks, as you mentioned, Andy, as Robbie/Pardue, that aired on CBS on December the 28th, 1982, which we may do as a commentary track somewhere down the line because that movie is wild. I don't know if you've seen Mazes and Monsters, Matt. I assume you have.
Oh yeah, I've seen it multiple times. Not because it's good, but because it's kind of crazy, and it's also just it epitomizes the whole Egbert case and the Satanic Panic as it stood in the early 1980s. And also, it just shows the craze of Dungeons and Dragons at the time. I mean, like I said, you had all these preteens and teenagers that were just jumping into the game and rising into popularity. I don't think Mazes and Monsters would have ever been made. I mean, sure, it wasn't a feature film, but it wouldn't have been made for TV if it wasn't for that happening.
Yeah, it's notable for a number of reasons. One is that, again, it's extremely loose understanding of D&D rules. I love the fact that they call the DM the Maze Commander. I just think that's a very, very funny term. And there's one character whose entire distinguishing characteristic is he just wears different types of hats. It's a very weird movie. If you haven't seen it, I recommend seeing it. You can find it on YouTube for free.
Robbie. Oh, you look terrific.
Yeah, you really do.
Freelick. Aren't you dead? Didn't you die when you leaped into the pit?
Hey, come on, Robbie, stop fooling around.
It is you, Freelick. You have been restored to the living. Whoever did that is a great holy man. A greater holy man even than I. Oh, Glacia. Nimble, too. Perhaps you are preparing for yet another quest?
Oh, Robbie.
Glacia, has someone placed a spell of forgetfulness on you? I am Pardue, the holy man. I've had many strange encounters since last we met. A great dragon, a Gorville. This is a good place to stay. Warm, very clean, and food is good and plentiful. Oh, Friedrich, I have something you may be interested in. I have an eternally renewing coin. Every night, I give it to my innkeeper's wife to pay for my lodging. And every morning when I awake, it is in my pouch again. Well, shall we not begin the quest?
Robbie.
But I just want to point out, Mazes and Monsters was not the only movie in the 1980s about Dungeons and Dragons games going crazy and dungeon masters and things killing people. I can't think of their titles offhand, but I have at least 2 or 3 other movies on my shelf that are very similar to Mazes and Monsters, with the dungeon master going nuts and berserk and killing all their players, or convincing the players to join a satanic cult, or just all these things. So this was a theme for sure for the 80s that made its way into, I mean, I don't know if I want to say Hollywood, but these things were made and they were broadcast somewhere.
You remind me, I found it, there's a group called the VHS Preservation Society, who basically they make DVD rips of like VHS movies that never made the move to other media. And they're always at cons. Like Kate and I, when we go to Blogfest, when we go to Monster Mania and stuff. And one time it was one called The Dungeon Master. It is incredibly shitty. It's just a piss poor movie. And I remember sitting down to watch it, and I just got so bored watching it. It's just not very interesting at all.
Yeah, there's the Dungeon Master. There's another one. I'm pretty sure the title was Hobgoblin. And I think there's at least one more. I have to check. I haven't watched these movies in years, but I have VHS or DVD. Well, if they're DVD copies, they're transferred from VHS because, like you just said, none of these were popular enough to come out in other formats from wherever they were originally released in the 1980s, but they're still there.
It's interesting to hear that there was more of a wave of them than I thought. I know that Mazes and the Monsters is the one that gets all the attention. I think mostly just because, it had Tom Hanks in it. So I think we're going to start wrapping up right here because all of this setup, talking about Egbert, talking about William Deere, talking about these early anxieties over Dungeons and Dragons, is prelude to talk about the real subject of this series. Patricia Pulling and Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons, which we will pick up next time. In the meantime, you can pick up Gathering of Gamers, Dungeons and Dragons, and other games through Gen Con, Matt Shoemaker's new book, which is available through Play Story Press, and I'll include a link in the description. And that will do it for today's episode of Scandalous Games. If you like what we're doing and want to help the show, subscribe or follow us wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a rating. If you want to learn more, check out our website, scandalousgamespodcast.wordpress.com, where I publish the show notes and sources for every episode. Our theme music is Occupy Seek Me by Seek Knowledge via the Free Music Archive, used under a CC BY NCSA 3.0 US license. If you have a question, comment, or idea for a topic for a future episode, email us at scandalousgamespodcast@gmail.com. And until next time, I'm Kevin Impellizzeri.
I'm Kate.
I'm Andy Hunter.
I'm Phil.
I'm Matt Shoemaker.
Thanks for listening. We'll see you next Scandal. Subscribe to Fat Roll Gaming on YouTube and listen to So We Were Talking About Beast Wars wherever you get your podcasts.